In the last part of the video, I said that primary research could be divided into the categories of experimental and non-experimental research, but primary research can also be divided into the categories of basic and applied research. So in this video, we'll talk about the difference between basic and applied research. Basic research is research that's done out of scientific curiosity. It's research that's done just because a person wants to get an answer to a question. So what I'm saying here is it's basic research is research that's done to test theories and learn about the world. Applied research is research that's done to help people or to solve real-world problems. In applied research, a researcher isn't just curious about something. In applied research, a researcher wants to find the most effective solution to a problem. And the researcher's ultimate goal is to solve that problem. So if a researcher wanted to find the most effective way to teach elementary school children, and the researcher did an experiment to try to compare different ways of teaching sixth grade children, that would be an applied study. The researcher is trying to improve education and solve a real-world issue. If a researcher wanted to find the best way to treat depression, and the researcher did an experiment comparing two therapies to see which one appears to be more effective, then that would be an applied study. The researcher is trying to help people and to solve the problem of depression. Also, if a researcher was doing a study to test whether Advil or ibuprofen is more effective at treating headaches, that would be applied research because the researcher isn't just curious whether Advil or Tylenol is more effective. The researcher is trying to solve a problem. The researcher wants to help people overcome their symptoms of headache. So let me just give a few more. Well, first of all, if a study is educational, or if it's on an educational topic like comparing teaching methods, or if it's clinical, if it's comparing treatments for disorders, or if it's medical, then those are all typically applied research. But I want to give a few more examples of basic research. So if a researcher goes into a lab and splits apart an atom just to see what's inside the atom, that's basic research, right? The researcher just wants to know what's in there. If a researcher sends a ship or a spaceship to Mars just to find out what's on the surface, that's basic research. The researcher just wants to answer a question. So that's the difference between basic and applied research. So basic research is what will come to mind for a typical person when a person hears the word science. If a typical person hears the word science, they're probably going to think of basic research and not applied research. So it's not always possible to tell if a study is basic or applied simply by knowing the topic of the study. And I'll give an example. So let's imagine that you hear about a study in which a researcher was testing whether pictures or words are easier to recall. And the researcher was asking one group to memorize pictures and another group to memorizing words, and comparing the performance of the two groups. Well, if the researcher just wants to know whether pictures are easier to remember than words, and the researcher just wants to answer the question, then it's basic research. But if the researcher is if the researcher wants to know whether a teacher should present words or pictures in class during lecture to enhance the memory of the learning material, then it would be applied research, right? Because the researcher, in that situation, the researcher just doesn't want to just answer the question. The researcher wants to improve education and solve a real-world problem. So a certain topic could go either way, depending on what the researcher's goal is. So yeah, that's the difference between basic and applied research. If you have any questions about the difference, just let me know. Before we wrap up this video, or this part of the video, I want to mention that basic research isn't research that has no applications to it. So I think that students sometimes get confused because they think that basic research must be research that has no real world value. And that's not true. The findings or the results of a basic study can lead to applications down the line. The results of a basic study could end up helping people at some point, but when a basic research study is done, the researcher's goal at the time isn't to help people. That's the idea. So imagine a researcher wants to know if pictures are easier to remember than words, and the researcher is simply curious about the topic, and the researcher does an experiment. That would be a basic research study. But maybe, let's say 5 years from now, a teacher might read about the results of the study and think, wow, that sounds interesting. I should probably start showing more pictures during lecture to help my students remember the main ideas that I'm presenting. That could happen. And that would be an example of a basic study leading to helping people down the line. So yeah, that's the, well, I pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about why it's important to study behavior scientifically and for psychology to be a science, and why we can't just observe behavior in daily life and rely on common sense and intuition.